Afternoon, everybody, and thanks so much for joining us at Secular AZ. We are a 501c3, C4 nonprofit focused on separation of church and state. As you all know, white Christian nationalism is the greatest threat to our democracy, and we are your voice for the separation of religion and government. We speak out to elected officials all across the state and at every level. So from school board all the way up to the governor. Make sure that you check out all of our social media channels, like, subscribe, share. We have great programming. Our Friday updates come from all kinds of amazing speakers. We have historians, authors, researchers, elected officials, journalists, you name it. Next Friday, we're going to be speaking with a true Arizona champion. Her name is Jen Marzin, and she is the executive director of Arizona Association of Counties. I crossed paths with her at the Capitol. And she is a consistent voice of reason down there, despite the fact that many times people ignore what she has to say. But we're working on doing a series of talks as we get ready for this 2024 election. And Jen will let you know exactly what's been going on at the county level and how she's been able to push away these lies and conspiracy theories that are pushed by extremists. So be sure to log in for that. But for today, I'm so excited. Today we have Jessica Calarco. She is an Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Madison's one of my favorite cities, and an expert on inequalities in family life and education. She is the author of the new book, Holding It Together, How Women Became America's Social Safety Net. Wait a second. Okay, hold on, Jessica. Became the social safety net. Have we not always been the social safety net?
I mean, I think there's moments in history where we could have gone a different way. And so that's part of what I talk about in the book is some turning points where we could have imagined a different world, but this is where we happen to be.
I think it's so fitting that we're having this discussion right now after the commencement speech given by the Kansas City Chiefs kicker Harrison Butker, whose name I wish I never even knew. And it sounds like most of his teammates feel the same way about him. So I cannot wait to hear what you have to say. And so I'm just going to go ahead and hand it over to you. I'll monitor the chat, and you can go ahead and take over the screen.
That sounds great. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be here with you all today. It's a pleasure to have a chance to chat about this book and to share a bit about the research that went into this and what it tells us for our current moment, including in the wake of recent events in the news. I'll post a link to the book that I'll be talking about in the chat in case you want to take a look to find out more details there. So basically, before I get started, I do want to briefly acknowledge a note of thanks to the team of research assistants, the amazing team of researchers who went into producing the interviews and also the surveys that I rely on in this book. This work would not have been possible without support from undergraduate and graduate students who contributed to this research and also from some funding agencies that helped to support this work as well. So basically, the gist of what I'll be talking about today is this idea that other high-income countries have invested in social safety nets to help people manage risk. They use things like taxes and regulations, especially on wealthy people and corporations, to protect people from falling into poverty, to give people a leg up in reaching for economic opportunities, and to ensure that people have time and energy to contribute to the shared project of care. Now, in the US, instead, we've tried to DIY society. We've kept taxes low. We've slashed huge holes in the meager safety net that we do have. And we also tell people that if you just make good choices, you won't need government support at all. And to the point about, how did we get here? We had some turning points in the wake of World War II, for example, because we needed women in the workforce. We put in place a national child care program through the Lanham Act that made it possible for families across the US to get low cost, high quality, full day childcare if they needed it to be able to work for pay. And we took that away as soon as the war ended and pushed women back home in ways that many of our peer nations did not. And so that sort of laid the groundwork for some of the policy decisions that I'll be talking about today. The problem, of course, is that in the absence of this kind of social safety net, some people in the US like to think that we can DIY society, but we really can't. And so essentially, forcing people to manage all of that risk on their own has left many American families and communities essentially teetering on the edge of collapse. But I argue in the book that we haven't collapsed because essentially women are the ones that, disproportionately at least holding it together, the ones who are filling in gaps in our economy and also gaps in our threadbare social safety net. In practice, that means that women are disproportionately the default caregivers for children, for the sick, for the elderly, for people who are struggling financially. And then they're also the ones who disproportionately fill the lowest paid jobs in our economy. Women hold 70% of the lowest wage jobs in the US economy, despite being only about 40 something percent of the workforce. And those are jobs oftentimes that are too labor intensive to be highly profitable or highly paid, including jobs in fields like childcare, customer service, home health care, and many retail sectors as well. And so all of that responsibility is really taking a serious toll on women. And yet, as I show in the book, that this kind of unpaid and underpaid labor that's disproportionately done by women helps to maintain this illusion of a DIY society. It makes it seem as though we can get by without this kind of social safety net that many other of our peer countries take for granted. And so, as I'll talk more about later, the sort of engineers and profiteers of this system, of this DIY society that we've created, have also promoted myths, including myths about gender, myths about kind of meritocracy, that help to, or that operate to sort of guilt and gaslight women who might try to complain about this system in the process, and to lure men into thinking that it's perfectly fine to let this system stand as well. So along those lines, and to kind of illustrate what I'm getting at here, let me tell you the story of one mom that really illustrates what our efforts to be a DIY society are costing women in the US. Akari is the mom, I use pseudonyms to protect the anonymity of the participants that I'll talk about here. She's a mom of two who has both Japanese and white ancestry. And she met her children's father, Theo, when they were both in college. But because of the high costs of college tuition, they both ended up dropping out before they finished their degrees, as about a third of students in the US do these days. Theo started his own home maintenance business, which was bringing in about $30,000 a year, and Akari at the time was helping to manage the business while also working in retail part-time. And things were fairly stable until their daughter May was born in 2015. At that point, they didn't have family nearby or friends who could help with childcare, but they also made too much together to be able to qualify for subsidies, though of course not enough to be able to afford the full price of childcare. And so Akari, in the process, ended up becoming a stay-at-home mom, and a pretty typical one at that. Typical, though, not in the sense of sort of stereotypical stay-at-home moms, but in the sense that my research shows that about 75% or almost 75% of American stay-at-home moms actually have household incomes of less than $50,000 a year. And that's because many of them are forced into this situation where they can't afford childcare. And that was the case for Akari. And she was still a stay-at-home mom when I first met her in 2019, at which point she was pregnant with her second child, her son, Ren. And she remained a stay-at-home mom until the summer of 2020, when unfortunately Theo, who she was engaged to at the time, died suddenly and unexpectedly near the start of the COVID pandemic. And like about half of all US adults, Theo didn't have any life insurance, and the little that they had in savings was not enough for her to keep paying rent in the process. And so Akari wanted to find a job that would allow her and her kids to stay in their apartment, but the local childcare centers where they were living in Indiana, they were all closed because of the pandemic. Most of the local businesses were laying people off. And so what Akari ended up doing was applying for welfare, applying for food stamps, and even moving into a women's shelter where she stayed for a few months with her kids before she could eventually get a spot in a public housing community. And this was deeply challenging for Akari, kind of emotionally, in terms of not only the sort of the grieving and the loss that went along with Theo's death, but also the logistics and the emotions of relying on the meager social safety net that we do have. Akari had grown up in a very Republican, very conservative community, and she never knew anyone growing up who had been on welfare, and she felt guilty about relying on what she called other people's tax money. And yet, at the same time, the meager support that Akari could get from welfare was only about $288 a month in Indiana as a mom of two. And even with extra support in the form of things like Medicaid and food stamps and subsidized housing and childcare, she rarely had enough money to make ends meet, especially to pay for things like car insurance, which weren't covered by any of those other types of aid. And meanwhile, on top of that, and adding insult to injury, Akari's welfare benefits required that she find paid work, even though her welfare benefits would be docked essentially for every dollar that she was going to earn. And so she ends up taking the first job that's available. And again, this is the fall of 2020, so there aren't that many jobs available. And so the best she could find was a no benefits part-time job in retail, which paid less than $10 an hour. So not surprisingly, she ends up adding a second low-wage part-time job in 2021, but she was still rarely getting enough hours to make ends meet, in part because things like the ACA, the Affordable Care Act rules, incentivize employers to keep workers working only part-time because then they don't have to pay for things like health insurance if they're working fewer than 25 hours a week. And so many low-wage employers will keep workers' hours capped in ways that prevent them from having to pay for benefits. And that was the case for the kinds of jobs that Akari was able to find. So in the end, she ends up taking a third job. So now she's working three jobs, with this third job being at a manufacturing facility where she works 12-hour shifts on both Saturdays and Sundays. To make that work childcare wise, the kids now spend weekends at Theo's sister's house. And because of the commute time, the manufacturing facility is a few towns away from where Akari lives. And so it doesn't make sense for her to pick the kids up and drop the kids off both days. So she drops them off on Friday evenings and then doesn't see them again until Monday mornings while she's away working at the plant on the weekends. And she hates that she doesn't get to spend the weekends with her kids. And she can see the toll that her absence is taking on them. She told me, my daughter has PTSD because of her father's death. She went from having a dad who works and being a daddy's girl and having a stay-at-home mom who always cared for her. And now there's no dad and mom's always working. So in her mind, she lost both parents. So, and the really rough thing here, I mean, this story, I've told it a lot of times, but it still makes me tear up in the sense that like this sacrifice, not being with her kids, hasn't left Akari all that much better off financially because it pushed her essentially over the benefits cliff in the sense that she talked about how there's not really a nice transition when it comes to many of these welfare programs. And that in the short term, she'd actually be better off financially if she were to quit that third job and go back on welfare. But at the same time, she knows that the clock is ticking. Most states have relatively short lifetime caps on welfare eligibility. In Indiana, that's 2 years for a lifetime for adults and 5 years for kids, though soft diversion tactics often mean that very few people stay on that long. And she told me, yeah.
One question, when you
Yeah.
say 2 years total, do you mean 2 years at a time or 2 years total from
2 years lifetime total. You can only receive welfare benefits in Indiana for 2 total years out of your lifetime.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, no, and that's many states. Some states have longer, but very few states have many much longer than that. Yeah, absolutely. And she talked about how she's like, welfare is not going to last forever, and I'm just going to get older. And so, you know, she talked about how, what am I going to do when I'm 60? And the other thing about welfare is that you can't have any money saved. In Indiana, for example, you can't have more than $1,000 in savings and still qualify for welfare. So she's like, how, you know, I have to find a job. I have to keep working, and maybe someday I can eventually get a raise. And so this is, you know, this is what she's up against. And this is what many women in particular are up against in our society. And she's not the only one. And certainly I think her story is particularly tragic, but she's not the only one among the many women that I talked to for this research who found herself in deeply challenging situations, trying to navigate our sort of threadbare and broken and deeply stigmatized social safety net. For this research and to tell you a little bit about the data, my team and I interviewed, we conducted more than 400 hours of interviews, in-depth interviews with families from across the socioeconomic and racial and political spectrum between 2019 and 2022, oftentimes doing multiple follow-up interviews with those same families over time. Most of those families were initially recruited through prenatal clinics in Indiana when they were pregnant with either their first or their second child. So we also did 2 national surveys, each with more than 2,000 parents of kids under 18 from across the whole US. And then in addition to those survey and interview data, as I was developing the book, I also drew on other sources of data to help kind of flesh out the arguments, including things like historical records, case studies of popular media, and certainly evidence from prior research as well. And really the big takeaway here from these data and from Akari's story in particular is that our attempts to DIY society have left American families kind of trapped in a constant state of precarity, but women are holding it together, you know, like we saw with Akari, and also with the other women around her, you know, her Theo's sister, for example, taking over care on the weekends, or the women who are running the food banks that she was relying on. Women are holding it together in ways that make it seem as though we can get by without a net in the process. So of course, at the same time, this raises questions about, so why don't women revolt? Why aren't women pushing back against this kind of a system? And part of the answer here is that the US traps women in motherhood. And certainly we're doing this in the context of the Dobbs decision, but this was happening, long before, in softer ways, often cultural ways that are embedded in things like, religious ideologies, for example. And that in the absence of a social safety net, once we push women into motherhood and leave them without affordable childcare and without access to things like paid family leave, it makes them very easy to exploit. So I'll tell the story of another mom that I'll call Brooke. Growing up, home was not a particularly happy place for Brooke. She was raised in a very conservative, white, working class, evangelical Christian family in rural Indiana. And her parents had a fairly volatile relationship when she was growing up. And given that upbringing, Brooke never wanted to have kids of her own, but then she ends up accidentally getting pregnant in college. And so Brooke and her boyfriend Brendan actually initially planned to get an abortion, and his parents even offered to pay for the procedure. But then Brooke's parents found out, and Brooke's mom persuaded Brooke that she should keep the baby, promising that Brooke could live at home and that she would help raise the baby so that Brooke could finish college. Once Brooke's son Carter was born, though, Brooke's parents told her that they couldn't afford to keep paying for both college and childcare. And without childcare, and both her parents were still working full time, they're fairly young. And without childcare, it was almost impossible for Brooke to keep up with her schoolwork. And she felt like she couldn't take night classes because, given her own upbringing, she didn't trust her parents to watch her son. And so Brooke ends up dropping out of college and moving also into a women's shelter, since being on her own would make it easier to qualify for things like subsidized apartments, and for programs like welfare and for WIC and for subsidized childcare. They all kind of have these wait lists that if you're the more precarious your situation, the higher up on the wait list that you can get. And so moving into a shelter, unfortunately, is one of the best ways to get to the top of the list. So essentially, since welfare, as we saw with Akari, comes with these work requirements, Brooke also had to take the first job that she could find, which like with Akari was also a minimum wage job in retail. And she talked about how much she hated that job, ironically, because it was actually working at the same store as her mom, which was not the best, not the ideal work environment for Brooke for lots of reasons. And so Brooke was complaining about the job to the director of her son's childcare center that he was attending at the time. And they sort of saw an opportunity because the center was struggling, like many childcare centers, with staff turnover. And so the director begged Brooke, like, hey, come work for us instead. If you hate your retail job, we have an opening, come work at the childcare center instead. And Brooke was kind of a little skeptical. She wasn't sure how she'd like childcare, but she ended up, taking this job and loving it, in part because it meant at the time she was paying almost as much for childcare as for rent. And so that helped out, but she also liked working with kids. At the same time, money remained a constant challenge. Even when she got promoted to assistant director of the childcare center a few years later, she was only making $25,000 a year. And so, given the precarity of this situation, Brooke thought about trying to go back to college. She wanted to become a nurse. She thought about how this would she saw this as a potential pathway to stability for herself and for her son, but she couldn't figure out how to make it work. She still didn't trust her parents to watch Carter, and so night classes still weren't an option, and she couldn't afford to quit her job, even with how little it paid. And so she just kept, and you also can't, things like college classes don't count toward work requirements for welfare, which meant that she couldn't, satisfy those requirements by going to school instead. And so Brooke was still working in that job 5 years later. When I first met her in 2019, by that point, she'd met and married her husband, Robbie, who's an auto mechanic, and given birth a second time to their daughter, Emma. But she still hadn't made any progress toward finishing this degree that she wanted. And in fact, her in-laws were pressuring her to drop out of the workforce and abandon her college plans because they thought it would be best for their new granddaughter to have a stay-at-home mom, even though Brooke's husband was only making $25,000 a year himself at the time. And so I think what Brooke's story illustrates here is that even before the Dobbs decision, the US was trapping women in motherhood. And it shows how that kind of trap, kind of in the absence of sturdy social safety net protections, it makes it very easy for our society to exploit women's unpaid and underpaid labor, to push them into the kinds of low wage positions, to push them into doing the underpaid care work, and certainly to push them into doing the unpaid labor at home. And so essentially women's labor by virtue, there's lots of ways that we can exploit people. There's lots of ways that we can exploit women. Motherhood, in the absence of a social safety net, is just a particularly effective one. And that's essentially what I'm arguing here, is that but when we can trap women in motherhood through these kinds of either cultural or legal means, we make it very easy to exploit women's labor in ways that maintains this illusion of a DIY society that essentially persuades Americans that we don't need a social safety net because families are able to get by on their own. Now, I show in the book how this system of exploitation is particularly damaging for women from low income and middle income families, and disproportionately for Black and Latino women and women from other racially marginalized groups. And these women can be easily forced into motherhood by virtue of the precarity of their situations, or into having more children than they planned, or at timings that aren't ideal for their lives. And then once they're caught in this sort of motherhood trap, they can be easily pushed into filling gaps in our economy and gaps in our social safety net. And that's, in part because in the absence of protections like universal paid leave and affordable childcare and universal health care, these women often have nowhere to turn for support in helping to raise their children that they now have to care for, and nowhere to hide also when others ask them to hold even more of the responsibility because the communities around them are struggling as well. To show what I mean here, I'll tell you about a mom that I'll call Patricia. Before the pandemic, Patricia, who is Black, was still married to her husband, Rodney, and they had 3 kids, a toddler and 2 in elementary school. At that point, Patricia was working full-time as a customer service agent for an insurance company, and Rodney was working full-time as a construction laborer. And then together they were earning about a little less than $30,000 a year. Patricia, who, unlike Rodney, has some college education, she might have been able to find a better job, a higher paying job, but she'd taken this job as a customer service agent, which she talked about as kind of repetitive and demoralizing, because it was the best remote work job that she could find before the pandemic, kind of before remote work was more of a thing. Being able to work remotely meant that she didn't have to pay for after school care for her kids, and it meant that she didn't have to scramble to make alternate arrangements if the kids got sick or if, school was closed for a day. At the same time, it also meant that Patricia was the default parent, which meant that when COVID-19 hit, Patricia and Rodney, like many of the couples that we talked to, never even talked about who was going to care for the kids when schools and childcare centers closed. That responsibility just fell to Patricia, and Rodney kept leaving the house every day to go to work. So this took a huge toll on Patricia. She talked about how, the stress of having the kids kind of constantly in the background while she's trying to do her work. She said, you start getting a headache and they want you to sit and listen to them and talk to them and everything. And it's like, just go, please, everybody, just leave me alone. At the same time, Patricia didn't like being short with her kids. She felt guilty about the way that she, had to treat them, had to tell them to go away while she was trying to work. She said, I have to work on that more. When it's time to clock out, I need to not clock out mentally as a mother too. And so kind of with that sense of guilt or failure kind of weighing on her conscience, Patricia decided in the fall of 2020 to cut back to just 4 days a week of paid work instead of 5. She figured that would give her more time and energy to focus on her kids' needs. And she also hoped that it would give herself more time to rest, which she needed in part because she recently found out at the time that she was unexpectedly pregnant with twins. So she's got 3 kids at home. She's now pregnant with twins. She's like, I need this extra day off. What happened, though, was that Patricia's extended family saw her extra day off as an opening to ask Patricia for more help. She's one of the people in her extended family one of the few people who has a reliable vehicle, and she and most of her relatives live in Indianapolis, which was recently rated as the worst city in the country when it comes to public transit in the U.S. And so, given those challenges, Patricia felt bad saying no when family members asked for her help. She said she rarely kind of turned people down. She said even when your whole day that you had to yourself ends up dedicated to running errands for someone else. And so essentially she wanted to carve out more time for herself, but she rarely followed through in part because she knew that her relatives had nowhere else to turn, but also because she worried that she might need help herself someday. And unfortunately, that someday came when Patricia and Rodney ended up getting a divorce just before the twins were born in the summer of 2021. Patricia and Rodney had previously separated and gotten back together a couple of times, oftentimes because of disputes about, childcare and responsibilities at home. And really the stress of the pandemic, as it was for many couples, was just sort of the last straw. But after the divorce, Patricia had to rely more on the people around her. She needed someone, for example, to drive her around after her C-section because she wasn't allowed to drive herself. And so she had to rely on friends and family members to be able to fill in those gaps, and relying on people to help watch her older kids while she took the little ones to the doctor, for example. And so this was, she felt grateful that she hadn't turned people away before because she still needed their support in those moments. Though at the same time, I think it's important to note that the support that she was able to get from her community wasn't necessarily enough to give Patricia a sense of security or stability. When my team and I last talked to her, she talked about how she has to remind herself to stay positive. She talked about how It's pretty depressing to have two brand new babies and you're doing this by yourself because you and your partner couldn't get along. And it's not like he's in jail, but he's not actually trying to be part of the kids' lives anyway. And it's just all on you. So I mean, I think that that sense of it's all on you was sort of a common thread among so many of the women that we talked to for this project, and certainly, especially during the pandemic, but certainly after that and before that as well. And so essentially, as we see in Patricia's story here, our attempts to DIY society have really decimated families and communities, and particularly Black families and Black communities in the US. In those kinds of contexts, it's almost impossible for women like Patricia not to get stuck filling in the gaps in our economy and filling in the gaps in our social safety net, because we really left them with nowhere to turn in managing all the responsibility that we've handed to them, and nowhere to hide when others see them as being a little bit more successful than others and ask them to try to hold even more responsibility in the process. At the same time, it's important to acknowledge that in this system, relatively privileged women do have it somewhat easier, in part because they can afford to offload or outsource some of the risk that they've been handed by pushing it onto others who are often in more vulnerable positions than themselves. So to see what I mean here, take, for example, a couple that I'll call Holly and Kathleen, who are a white same-sex married couple. When their daughter Willow was born in 2019, Holly and Kathleen had initially planned to split paid work and childcare, as evenly as possible. But ultimately, the childcare crisis got in the way. They, like many couples, didn't have family nearby who could help, and the childcare centers they found in their community had huge wait lists for infant care. And so the best option that they could find was a part-time spot that wouldn't be available until their daughter Willow was almost 9 months old. And so to make it work in the meantime, Holly and Kathleen decided that Holly would work for pay part-time while Kathleen would work for pay full-time. Since Holly, at least in theory, she worked as a sort of data analyst, that she could do her parts of her job remotely while caring for Willa at home, kind of that double duty of remote work and childcare, while Kathleen was working in law enforcement, and her job could only be done outside the home and also paid more. So it made more sense, for at least financially, for her to be the one who kept leaving the house for work every day. And that arrangement worked for like the first couple of weeks when Willow was napping all the time, but the older that she got, the harder that was for Holly to be able to manage. And by the time she was a few months old, Holly just couldn't wait for Willa to be able to start childcare. Though, I mean, their daughter was born in 2019. So unfortunately, what happened was that almost as soon as they started full-time childcare, or not even quite full-time childcare, COVID-19 closes their childcare center, and they end up essentially right back where they were before, with Holly caring for Willa while working from home part-time, and with Kathleen leaving the house to go to work. And meanwhile, even when the center did eventually reopen, staffing shortages meant they could only offer care from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. They'd sort of initially promised we'll be open full time, but hey, look, we can't, like many centers across the US, we're running short on staff, we don't have the people. And Holly was deeply frustrated at that point. She had planned to go back to a full-time position and kind of lined it up with her boss, and that had taken a lot of negotiations. And so she goes into the center to try to complain. And she talked about she wanted to go to the director of the center to complain about sort of this idea that they were still paying the full price for care, even though they were only getting part-time hours. And she also perceived what she talked about as a sort of decline in the quality of care, because there was so much staff turnover during the pandemic. She's like, look, it's all these women who don't have much experience in childcare. When she went to complain, though, what Holly learned was essentially the economics of childcare. The director kind of walked her through the finances of what was going on behind the scenes. And what Holly learned in the process was that the center couldn't afford to pay enough or offer the kinds of benefits that they would have needed to be able to recruit and keep highly trained and highly experienced staff. She talked about how she learned, for example, that one of Willa's teachers who had left had medical debt that she'd accrued and was still paying off years later because she didn't have access to health insurance and had left to find a better job because the job in childcare just didn't pay enough. And so this left Holly feeling deeply guilty. She told me, she said, Kathleen and I just felt really guilty about being complicit in this thing where it's like, oh, we have all these women of color watching our kids and we're not really taking good care of them. And so the guilt of that complicity kind of weighed heavily on Holly, but at the same time, she also recognized that the precarity of her own situation and the way that she needed childcare to be able to have opportunities for herself in life made it very hard to push back against this kind of system of exploitation that she was ultimately part of. She said, look, we have more than we need right now, but it could change at any moment when there's not that social safety net. And so you're like, I guess I should just hoard it in a giant pile and sleep on top. And that sense of like kind of moral uncertainty or moral ambiguity was common in many of the families that we talked to who were kind of in this more privileged position and trying to make it work, seeing kind of how dependent they were on this kind of exploitation, but not being able to see a way through. At the same time, though, and as we also see in Holly's story, I mean, yes, some women are benefiting from the exploitation of others, particularly those who are in more vulnerable positions, because that exploitation, makes it more possible for them to afford to outsource help with care. At the same time, it is important to acknowledge that even that in this DIY system, kind of even relatively privileged women are drowning because the great risk shift has really left all but the wealthiest families. I'll talk more about that risk shift in a minute, has really left all but the wealthiest families with more responsibility than they can manage. And because what's left over after outsourcing usually falls to women, even when men could, in theory, do more to fill in the gaps. And so along those lines, I'll tell you one other story. So this is Virginia, who's a tenure track professor at a leading research university, makes about $75,000 a year. And she's the clear breadwinner in her family. Her husband, Charles, is a middle school math teacher and has a master's degree, makes about $45,000 a year. Despite being the primary breadwinner, and actually what research shows is that even when moms are the primary breadwinner, they're still often the default parents. They still actually do more of the child care than when moms and dads actually earn the same amount of money within their households. And that was very much the case. She's, the default parent for their two young kids. As a member of the sandwich generation, she's also the default caregiver for her aging parents. And in the middle of the pandemic, her mom was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, which added to sort of complexities in terms of family care responsibilities too. And all that responsibility really made it difficult for Virginia to feel as though she could ever really concentrate enough to make progress with her research. She talked about how I do actually have a brain. I love thinking, and I'd love to be able to do that again sometime. At the same time, Virginia also balked at the suggestion, which she often heard from her employers, that she should just kind of, that she'd be more productive at work if she just invested in a little bit of self-care. And she said, self-care is just a way that institutions have offloaded the responsibility for enacting humane work. And really, I mean, she insisted that what she really needed was institutional support. She said, I need the child tax credit to come back. I need a financial cushion. I need time and reliable care for my children. I need consistency. I need institutions to step up to do what they're supposed to be humane. But they're not humane. Institutions don't take care of you. Institutions take care of themselves. And so essentially, Virginia's lament here makes clear that we already know what the problem is, and we already know the solution. The solution is to build the kind of social safety net that would actually protect us all. But we haven't built that kind of social safety net because essentially what I talk about in the book is kind of the engineers and profiteers of our DIY society. So big businesses and billionaires and the sort of people who work around them in the system essentially have us right where they want us. And they've promoted, as I talk about in the book, kind of myths that help to keep us from fighting to demand the myth that we desperately need. And when I talk about this DIY society that they're promoting, I'm essentially talking about neoliberalism, this idea that people are supposed to be able to support themselves without assistance or interference from the state. And this neoliberal model was developed by a group of Austrian economists in the 1930s. And around that time, business leaders in the US were looking for a way to fight against the higher corporate taxes that policymakers had imposed to pay for Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. And so what they did essentially was paid elite American universities to hire these neoliberal Austrian economists, put them in sort of endowed professorships at universities, and then train the next generation of economists and business leaders and political leaders in the US, including folks like Milton Friedman was one of the trainees, and that name may ring a bell. And the result of these efforts was what political scientist Jacob Hacker calls the Great Risk Shift, which involves essentially a massive reduction in corporate and personal tax rates, which is what I'm showing up here on the slide, deregulation of corporations, getting rid of campaign finance laws, and also efforts to make the social safety net as small and weak and stigmatized as possible, shifting from the AFDC model of welfare to the TANF model, for those of you who are more familiar with those wonky details, things along those lines. And so also the other part of the equation here was that to justify this risk shift, neoliberal economists and policymakers developed propaganda campaigns, things like General Electric Theater, to convince Americans that we don't actually need the government or even our employers to protect us, and that we're actually safer without a net because we'll be more likely to make the kinds of choices that will keep ourselves safe from risk in the process instead. Now, scholars have thoroughly debunked the kinds of core assumptions of neoliberal economics, but the engineers and profiteers of our DIY model have promoted myths that help to maintain the illusion of these ideas. And those myths include, I talk about in the book, the myth of meritocracy, the myth of Mars and Venus, which is the Harrison Butker story. Very much, it kind of encapsulates this idea that men and women are just different and women are happier at home. That's a core myth that unfortunately data suggests is becoming more prevalent in American society today. There's recent polls that show that millennial and Gen Z men are actually more likely to believe that feminism is causing harm to society, and that we've gone too far in making things kind of equal, that we're to the point where we're hurting men, that we should go back to more traditional ways. So I'm not super hopeful for the future on that front. But essentially, the problem with these myths is that they delude and divide us. They delude us into believing that we can get by without a social safety net. I show in the book how believing things like the myth of meritocracy, that most people can get ahead as long as they're willing to work hard, or believing the sort of myth of Mars and Venus, that women are just happier at home, or that kids are better off with moms at home. People who buy into those ideas are disproportionately likely to reject the need for stronger social safety nets. And so that's one piece of what these myths do. And these are myths that are promoted by religious institutions, by the self-help industry, by lots of other, cultural forces in our society. The other thing that these myths do is divide us. They divide us by race and class and gender and religion and politics in ways that prevent us from coming together to demand the kind of safety net that would better support us all. And they do that in part. I talk in the book about one mom who's a conservative evangelical Christian mom, by promoting a sense of moral superiority. The meritocracy myth, for example, buying into that idea that hard work alone can get you to success. She's a mom who her household income is only about $30,000 a year. She's a stay-at-home mom. Her husband is an evangelical Christian pastor at their church. And they would benefit from a stronger social safety net, but not having that net allows her to feel morally superior to women who are just a little bit lower on the economic ladder than herself. She talked about, for example, how even though she cashed the checks during the pandemic for the child tax credit and for the stimulus payment, she's like, we didn't need those. We're used to getting by on one meager salary. Like, we're frugal, we make good choices. And she talked about how she even kind of drew on kind of racist tropes to argue that if other women did need that money, they must have been paying to get their nails done. They must have been going out and hiring babysitters so that they could go partying, kind of relying on these kinds of welfare queen type stereotype tropes to argue that she was better off, or she was kind of morally superior to other families who needed this kind of support in a way that, at least in her perception, she did not. And so essentially, to that end, and drawing inspiration from kind of feminist thinkers, folks like Bell Hooks and Sylvia Federici, I argue in the book that the best way forward is through what I would call a union of care. And the idea here is that, unlike with traditional labor unions, this kind of a union would represent and unite not only paid care workers, but also people who are involved in the kind of unpaid project of care, both the caregivers and the care recipients. Essentially, what we need is a broad coalition organized around the idea that care links all of our fates. Paid work only affects so many of us, but all of us will need and participate in the project of care at some point, and often at many points in our lives. We will always need care, and most of us will be in a responsibility position to give care to others. And so if we focus on that, we can see past some of these myths that are designed to delude and divide us, and focus instead on the kinds of social safety net programs that we could put in place, not only to strengthen, not only to kind of ease the burden that folks have to manage in terms of the care responsibilities and other types of responsibilities that have been pushed onto them by the Great Risk Shift, but also help people to more actively and equitably participate in this shared project of care. And in practice, that means, removing some of the profit pressures around kind of care work, making sure that these systems are universal and supported and easily accessible to all. It also means treating people with dignity and not as cogs in a machine, and also caring for the people who care. And this means both the paid care workers, making sure that that work is sustainable and can be done with dignity, but also acknowledging, to that point I was making before, that all of us have a role to play in the unpaid work of care, that not all care work can ever be paid. We can't outsource all of this labor. And so instead, what we need are things like paid time off from work, paid vacation time, paid family leave, paid personal time that we can use to better, and also limits on things like paid work hours, so that we have the time and the energy and the capacity for all of us, men, women, people of all genders, to be able to participate more equally and more sustainably in this larger shared project of care. So this is the world I would argue that we ought to be imagining, which is essentially a world where we're holding it together rather than pretending that we can hold it together. Thanks.
Wow, that is There's so much that I have written down that I need to process right now. First of all, the first thing I wrote down was how you said, I think it was the couple in Indiana and the woman who lost her husband, $288 a month was what she was getting. My question too then there is Indiana one of those states that has only who has the national minimum wage 7.25?
Yes, exactly. So it's a 7.725 an hour minimum wage state. Yeah. And the states, we can think about how if women are the ones who are disproportionately holding the lowest wage jobs in our economy, they're the ones who are also disproportionately affected by those state level decisions to not raise the federal minimum wage. And so when we've seen states refuse to do so, it's really hurting women more than anyone else in our economy.
And I mean, at this point, I feel like those of us who live in Arizona really need to give a big, huge shout out to organizations like Lucha, who have essentially helped to boost our statewide minimum wage, because they worked for many years to increase that minimum wage. So I don't know what we're at now, but it's like maybe $13 an hour, which still isn't quite enough when the average home price here in Phoenix is like, I think, $420,000. And there was just something recently about how you need to earn $80,000 to be able to afford like a 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom apartment that you don't even own. Um, the other thing that really struck, there's so many things that I wrote down here. But like my background is in education and I'm a teacher, middle school and high school. And like, whenever I was teaching, I taught middle schools and high schools that were Title I schools. And, so many of those parents work 2, 3 jobs. Of course, yes. Do we have some parents who maybe aren't making the best decisions and that's why they're never present in their kids' life? Sure. But for the most part, the vast majority of those parents in those working class neighborhoods where the school population, it was 100% free and reduced lunch. It was because that's what they had to do to be able to do it. And like you were saying with the first couple, the one whose husband died during COVID, like that's what ends up happening to those kids, right? Like mom's trying to keep it together and she's got to do whatever she can for her own kids, but what ends up happening is then the kids are running around with like, you know, people who don't have their best interests at heart, or they're getting themselves into dangerous situations, or it's just heartbreaking, really.
Yeah, and it gets at the idea. I talk in the book about how we have these sort of ideas that, if we tell people that you just have to make good choices. And that's kind of the core of this neoliberal ideology, that if you just tell people to make good choices, then they'll keep themselves safe. They'll make the decisions that they need to avoid falling into precarity or to avoid needing government support. But the reality is that good choices are much easier to make in the context of high levels of privilege. And so essentially, the more precarious the situation that people are in, the harder it is to have the opportunity, to have the resources, to have the sort of wherewithal to make those choices that are, even the opportunity to make those choices that can keep us safe. And so I think it's this sort of pernicious system where we tell people to make good choices, which means that we can then blame them when we don't. And so that justifies not giving them the support that they need.
And you know what, as a teacher too, I've known a lot of young teachers who have made the decision once they get pregnant, would they like to continue working? Absolutely. But when they look at it, it actually makes more sense for them to step down, to not renew their contract. We already have a teacher retention crisis, but the reason why is because they could actually, because putting them in daycare would be the equivalent essentially of like one of their paychecks, or being able to insure them. So I know so many women who have stopped teaching and then they qualify for these social programs. And thank goodness Arizona doesn't put limits on it, like a 2-year thing. That's
Mhm.
bananas. I can't even wrap my head around how little for all the people who say I'm pro-life and every baby is precious and, pre-born and all that nonsense. Well, where's the support after the birth? The hypocrisy is glaring.
Yeah, no, and I think the hypocrisy gets at the idea that really when people are pushing to increase the population through, increased childbirth, it's often because they want people as kind of economic cogs in a machine. In the sense that, there was a Washington Post op-ed from the other day arguing that the solution to the Social Security crisis is for women to step up and have more babies. When there are so many other possible ways that we could solve that crisis, everything from eliminating income caps on Social Security contributions to increasing taxes on wealthy people and corporations to increasing immigration, that all of these are possible ways to very easily solve the Social Security crisis. But instead, we're putting that onto women to solve the crisis instead.
And again, it makes me think, like so I am a recent new grandmother, and I have, because I was one of those moms who, when my kids were little, we did qualify for Medicaid and we did qualify for food stamps and they did qualify for, all kinds of different things. And I have no regrets about it, no shame about it. But like the lowest paid individuals in this country are, early childhood educating, or, like preschool, childcare. Our teachers are probably second in that lowest paid kind of thing. You talked about women, but it
Mhm.
makes me think of also like countries like Finland, right? Where they send, they have this comprehensive, amazing safety, social safety net for people. And they send everybody home regardless of what their income is, right? With this like baby box, and they've got lactation consultants and everything to make sure that that child, because as a new grandmother, I'm like watching this kid in awe, because when I was young, I was super stressed out and broke all the time. And I love them, but I wasn't able to be in awe of them. And now I'm in awe, and I'm just like thinking about his beautiful little brain and how all of these crazy things are happening in his brain from 0 to 3, and how little priority we put into that well-being and that nurturing of that beautiful little brain. Makes me crazy.
Yeah, no, and I mean, and how, I mean, and on that front, I mean, the lack of paid family leave too, in addition to the lack of affordable childcare. I talked to one mom who's a school bus driver, and did not qualify for any paid time off, when her kids were born. And so she was back in a bus seat, driving a bus, still bleeding from childbirth, which is just, the horrors of what we put women through in this country. And she was the primary breadwinner for her family. So she had no choice to take time off. And that's, increasingly the case for many women in low income families, especially as we see women going to college in higher numbers than men. We see a kind of a flip in terms of now we're seeing larger numbers of women, even though they're not making much because they're often pushed into feminized jobs, they're still, even when they're the primary breadwinner, those families are often still struggling very deeply financially, and it can create those kinds of really deeply challenging situations, childcare and personally wise.
And I mean, for some people, it could take years to overcome, if you ever are even able to overcome those,
Absolutely.
financial hardships.
Yeah.
I'm just going to go through some of the comments. Sandra says, this reminds me of the book Poverty by America. Um, Rebecca says, Brooks' story resonates. I work in the library. There's a term, vocational awe, coined by one of ours, that I'm constantly fighting, which justifies low pay. Oh my gosh, true.
Mhm.
Which justifies low pay in many predominantly female industries. I too feel stuck in a cycle and often joke, oh, that's why women marry dull men with big salaries. Guilty, guilty, sorry. They want to live in a house someday and occasionally sit down. Ain't that the truth? I do in fact rebel, but a rebellion of one just looks like a temper tantrum. Oh my God, that's so funny, Rebecca. Thanks for that. Let's see. Ian says risk shift is such a good tool to think about all this with. Yes. Phil says, aside from neo economists and corporations, who else would you consider an engineer and or profiteer of the DIY mindset?
Yeah, so certainly, I mean, I think we can think about both, corporate elites, people who are both leaders of large corporations and those who are profiting from our highly financialized market economy. These are wealthy people, but also the people who support wealthy people. They're wealth managers, they're sort of, business managers. There's lots of people who support the industry of wealth and who have vested interest. Certainly, you could also think about policymakers. Essentially, the people who are bankrolling all of this, the billionaires and these big corporations need somewhere to funnel their money, because at least in a democracy, or so-called democracy, you can't influence policy directly with money. You need to have someone who is a policy maker who can make those kinds of choices for you. And that's essentially, I talk about Build Back Better in the book. And essentially, we had this moment where we got very close to putting in place some of these policies that would have actually gotten us, a little bit closer to par with many of our European allies. But really what happened was, the same the Republican big donors who funded Trump's campaign went in and gave money to Kirsten Sinema and to Joe Manchin, who essentially killed the bill by being bought out in the process. And there's pretty solid evidence of that. And so, I mean, it suggests that there's this system where wealth can translate directly into political, or kind of indirectly into political power, by buying off politicians who are willing to either because of their own moral persuasion or their kind of persuadability through capital, are willing to vote the way that the corporate interests want them to. And that's very much the system we find ourselves in part because we got rid of campaign finance laws. We made it possible to have super PACs. We made it possible to, for corporations and wealthy people to give almost unlimited money by funneling it through these other kinds of often very secretive organizations where it's hard to track who's spending what and where the money's going. And this is deeply damaging to our country in terms of making it harder for people to fight back. I mean, we are in a situation like it is still technically a democracy, and there are still more of us than there are of them. So like we could push things the other way. And that's where I see some hope in this idea of like a union of care, in the sense that if we can persuade people to look past these myths that divide us, to reject some of these ideas, to call out that mythical thinking when we find ourselves falling into it, there is a chance for the majority of us to say, no, we actually need better policymakers. We need better policies. But it will take, rejecting those myths to get to that point and to persuade enough people to get on board to, push past the influence of money in politics that we see right now.
Yeah, and I mean, like for those of us who are on this call, I bet you there's quite a few people on this call who probably walked and knocked doors or phone banked for Kirsten Sinema. So it stings a little bit extra because she used to be a Green Party member, and then suddenly she's giving curtsies as she's voting against the people that elected her. Let's see. Ian says, trying to capture this concept, self-care is a way we've come to accept as dealing with how we've allowed employers to treat us poorly to the point that we need to recover from the experience. Yeah, that I love that, like turning that around, like, because, we always talk about self-care, especially those of us who are monitoring like the legislature and all these bad bills that are going through. But really the self-care could come if like maybe our government actually cared about us.
Yeah, that we wouldn't need as much. And we have I think I was the last numbers that I looked up, I think the self-care industry is it's like 40 something billion dollars a year and projected to get to $80 billion in the next 10 years, or like the self-help industry. And so it's this idea that like we tell people all these quick fixes to solve the problem on their own, but it's just promoting the same DIY model and kind of essentially gaslighting people into blaming themselves when it's not them, it's society that's causing the problems that they face.
Yeah, it's such an integral part of our individualistic society, right? Like we've been bred to think like, it's all up to us. We can't believe in a collectivist kind of culture at all. And there's so many times where I just wish that I'd love to at least know what it was like to live in a culture, to be raised in a culture that had more of a collectivist attitude where we're all like, hey, my neighbor's really struggling. Maybe I should help them. Like I remember there was this guy in the school district where I used to be on the school board, and he would talk about how the culture, if you had somebody in the neighborhood who wasn't taking care of their yard, well, you're going to call the hotline, the tip line for, whatever government agency is going to give them a fine. And he was like, no, what we're going to do is we're going to go to that person's house and say, how can we help you? We're here to help you clean up your yard because we don't want it to turn into a fine. Like that's the kind of culture that I want to live in,
Yeah, and that's the thing that like we need, and the problem is that, we're caught in this system where everything is so deeply unequal and there's so much pressure even on relatively high income families to stave off precarity that none of us have the time or the energy to take care of our neighbors that way. That so many of us feel like we just have to focus on devoting as much of our time as possible to paid work and to helping ourselves or our kids get ahead, as opposed to thinking like what would it take for us to be in a society where we have the time and the energy to notice our neighbors, to notice who needs help and to be able to provide that help in the process too.
Well, and also, I mean, like our society does a really good job of like, instilling fear in the other, the perceived
Yes,
other. Just go to your next door page and you'll be able to see that.
very much so. Yes.
Farrell says this is so good. I love this question or comment, or I don't know. The social safety net for women fleeing violent, abusive, intimate partners is completely overloaded and broken. Exploitation of women causes them to stay in these relationships. And like now, especially, that's such a great comment, Farrell, because now, especially too, with the forced birth and the fact that they're, in some states trying to bring back no fault divorce. You can't get an abortion if you're married. Doesn't matter if the guy, and it was a very triggering video that I saw today of Puff Daddy and what happened with that. But like, you know, you don't even have an option to get out of a situation like that if you're a holy vessel carrying a child these days. So like I'd love to hear, do you speak to that? Of course, I'm sorry, I haven't
Yeah.
read your book, but I fully plan
No,
on
no, no, that's okay. Yeah. And
but do
certainly
you
there
speak
are,
about that? Yeah.
yeah, there are some couples that we interviewed for the book, or women that have dealt with domestic abuse, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and also maybe not even violence in some cases, but deeply difficult or damaging or relationships in many ways. I talked to one mom, for example, who was an elementary school teacher, and who during the pandemic caught her. She had two young kids. She's teaching remotely, trying to care for these two kids whose childcare center is closed. Her husband works at a distribution center, and he starts spending more and more time away from home. And she catches him messaging other women on Snapchat, and asking for what she calls sort of dirty pictures, and confronts him about it. But he sort of gaslights her and says, like, no, like you don't want me to have any friends. Like this is all just in fun. And she at the same time feels like she can't leave because her salary is not all that high, and she's worried about, and his salary is not all that high, and so she's worried about, can I maintain the standard of living for myself and my kids that I have, that I'm able to support, like that we can provide with two incomes together? Would I be able to achieve that if we had to divide this across two households, if I was trying to support my kids on my own? And that's, unfortunately, what the research tells us is that actually unmarried women are happier than married women are. Marriage is not great for women. On the emotional side of things, financially, women in marriage often are better off, and divorce does oftentimes increase hardship in ways that can discourage women from getting divorced. And I talked to one mom even who was in a very difficult situation with her partner, and stayed for the health insurance. That was the only way that she knew she'd be able to get good quality mental health care. That she was worried about whether Medicaid would be able to provide the quality of mental health care that she needed for herself, given various issues, and regular health care as well for some ongoing chronic issues that she had. And so that was what ultimately persuaded her to stay. And that's, a very, it's a hard thing to sit with in terms of the way that we leave women vulnerable to difficult and dangerous situations. Even those with privilege, who oftentimes feel like they can't sort of maintain their standard of living if they leave, and certainly for those who are in more vulnerable positions too.
Yeah, and the work that I do too, there's this trad wife phenomenon, right? Like trad
Oh,
wives, traditional wives who are there, like, like this guy Harrison Butker's wife. He bragged about how she has no desire to do anything but just like monitor whatever he's doing, take care of their children, and like fawn over him, I guess. Like, but because of the work that I do, I will like I have like ex trad wife as kind of a like, let me know. And some of the stories is some of these women who come out of these like, Mormon marriages with men where they've had 6 or 8 kids, and then suddenly they've cheated on them, and now the wife is left with nothing, and they haven't utilized their college degree in like 20 years, and suddenly they have zero work history, a hostile, maybe even abusive ex, who's told all kinds of lies, and literally no safety net for them at all. It's horrible. We could probably talk all day, so I want to just at least try to get to the people's questions. So Phil says, and this is another great question. Jessica, have you investigated how trends have evolved over time? Specifically, do you think men are doing more now than in the past to help share the workload with women?
so certainly compared to previous generations of men on average are doing more today than they used to be. Especially, dads with young children are doing a larger share. I wouldn't say that that's necessarily enough though to solve the problem. And even during the pandemic, we saw, for example, that men and women both substantially increased things like their childcare hours and housework time. But as soon as things started to reopen, it actually went back to where things were before the pandemic, and even got a little worse for women, because men in many cases sort of rushed back to the office and left women at home, to manage and to continue being the default parent once things reopened in that front. And even one of the saddest things that came out of the research, one of the surveys that we did during the pandemic, we asked parents how often, kind of 2,000 parents across the US, how often are you yelling at your kids? And white dads with college degrees were off the charts compared to everybody else. Like 60% of them said they were yelling at their kids at least once a day, compared to like 30% of everyone else. And it was because those were dads who were able to work remotely, but didn't have a lot of experience trying to work remotely while also providing care in the way that a lot of moms did. And so it made them frustrated, and it actually pushed many women to tell their partners to go back to the office. Because I talked to one mom, she described both her and her partner were able to work from home, and she told him to go back to the office because she said the days that he was his home, it was chaos, that he was constantly yelling at the kids, and the stress of it. And she ended up gaining 40 pounds in 3 months, started drinking more heavily, but she still felt like she was the one who was in a better emotional position to be able to manage the kids than her husband, who was just yelling at them all the time. And so I think we have to be careful about, like, yes, they are doing more, but we haven't put in place the kinds of conditions, reducing things like ideal worker norms, pressure toward overwork, reducing the inequality of our society in ways that would make it possible for men to do that work sustainably, and in a way that is actually helpful to the families that they're part of.
There are so many great comments in here, and we're just not going to get to them all, folks. I'm so sorry, but Rebecca, this one's funny. She says, have more babies. Ha ha ha. No, absolutely not. Is the one power I can withhold from these people, and I intend to keep it locked down. Good job, Rebecca. Yeah, there's so many other great comments, but I'm just saying, yeah, and people are also, it's not just me obsessing over the rainbow pattern in your books in the background.
Thank you.
I have a new project for this weekend, so thank you very much for that.
Yeah, well, it was such a pleasure chatting with you, and thank you to all of you who are here today. And thank you for your great comments and for the questions that you raised too. This has been a real pleasure.
Well, and again, please make sure, folks, that you order this book. I know that I am going to be ordering this book as soon as I get off this call today, because I cannot wait to read it. And I feel like it's going to be a lot of things that I already know. Now, I typically, when we end these kind of discussions, Jessica, because they're kind of heavy, like this is a heavy discussion, and you did some seriously heavy research, and shout out to the undergrad and the master's students who helped you out with this. But given the kind of like depressing work that you do, how do you maintain hope?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think that comes from the fact that we do have a situation where we can look to others, that we can take some of the nice thing about sociology for me is that it helps to kind of ungaslight ourselves. That once you can see these structures, you don't have to blame yourself in quite the same way that you do if you buy into the sort of DIY model. And so for me, that kind of ungaslighting gives me hope that I can, reuse that energy that I might use on self-criticism to try to connect with others and to try to find those spaces of kind of shared energy where we can push for social change. And so to me, that gives me hope that I can sort of redirect that energy toward more positive collectivism and social change through the kinds of groups that I can be part of.
And I think that that is really great advice too. Let's all ungaslight ourselves and ungaslight every single person that we cross paths with, because we're all being gaslit right now in this timeline, and nobody deserves that. So, but we do. I don't even know if we deserve you, Jessica. I mean, honestly, this was such a great discussion. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to our little group today. I hope that you see more people buying your book, because I can't wait to buy it. So thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much. I hope you all have a lovely day.
Thanks, Jessica. Have a great weekend, everybody. Take care.
Bye.